So there was another Lindsay-like case out in the Maritimes, and the protagonist this time is Rick Mehta. Hi, Rick. I read about you, haven't met you. So glad you could come. Maybe you can pick up this story and give us the Maritime chapter.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll be approaching this from a slightly different angle, coming from what it's like from the professor's point of view and trying to put the role of the university in society. So the general way I've had this structured is that I want to explain how a lack of viewpoint diversity in our universities is actually undermining free speech. And at the end, I'll propose some solutions that can be discussed. So I guess the question that's on your mind is, what does he mean when he says that there's a lack of viewpoint diversity? So if we look in the United States and we examine the ratio of professors who are either left-leaning or far left, and compare that to the ratio of the number of professors who are on the right end of the political spectrum, depending on the studies, the estimates can range from anywhere typically in the 6-to-1 ratio to 60-to-1. So so there is this bias in terms of leaning towards the left end of the political spectrum. And so now, that's for the US, and I believe those same data are applicable in the Canadian context. So in terms of what I think makes Canada unique, though, from the US, though, is that our universities are publicly funded for the most part. They're also, with most of the faculty who are tenured or on the tenure track, tend to be unionized, which is very different from the US. And in Canada, compared to other countries, if someone is in a union, dues are mandatory regardless of whether they actually want to be in the union or not. And so there's many reasons why we should be concerned about the lack of viewpoint diversity at our institutions. The one that I'll focus on is that when you have a group of people who think in a very similar way, that creates ideal conditions for extreme views now to take hold and then take over. And so in terms of what's happening now behind the scenes is that our universities now are committing themselves to the goal of social justice. And this runs counter to their traditional role of being places where ideas can be freely exchanged. And so in terms of why I'm very deeply concerned about this, is that this is a major change in the function of our universities, and this is happening without the knowledge of the general public or any consent or any kind of discussion. And I think what makes me also concerned, as this is happening at a time, as we've seen in the various sessions here, where we're in this age of accelerating change, as well as a polarization of society. And this is precisely the time when we need our graduates to be informed and engaged citizens who can actually think critically. So we can ask ourselves then, what does social justice entail? So I can summarize it as 4 principles. So the first major one is that emotions take precedence over objectivity and being rational. So it's basically to the point where being objective and rational is just discounted altogether. And so the reason that's given for that is that being objective and rational is a form of oppression. So some of the views that are espoused are ones like math is racist, or farmers markets are a sign of white supremacy. Okay. Then the other 3 principles that are coming out of our universities are based on principles that in mainstream society, I think the way we would use them is very different from the way they're now being used in the university system. So the first one is that of equity. So now what's happening is that equity is being defined as equality of outcomes as opposed to equality of opportunity. So to give you an example then, if we're going to have a discussion about the wage gap, so we know there is a statistical disparity between the earnings of men and the earnings of women. So the only explanation that's considered now in the university context is systemic discrimination. So then other explanations like number of hours worked that differ or career choices, so those are all variables that play a role, but those just cannot be discussed anymore. And if you try to bring up an issue such as biological sex differences, that's treated as a form of blasphemy. So then next then is the principle of diversity. So diversity is definitely, I think that's definitely one of the great things about Canada and how it's changed in the time that, when I was born in the 70s with the October crisis compared to now. But it's the way that that principle is adopted in the university context, which is about focusing on our differences and really accentuating them, as opposed to the way I think we would use them, which is try to find our common humanity first, and then use that as context, and we can now settle our differences. Then the third is the idea of inclusion. So the way it's now being used is that everyone must feel included. And so the idea is that if even one person is offended, then discussion on issues is no longer acceptable. So you can imagine then there's going to be various implications then when we're changing the function, the way that ideas are actually now discussed in the university system. So in terms of what it's like from a student perspective then, is that students who might be disagreeing with the far left kind of orthodoxy would be afraid to express their views because they'd be fearing retaliation in the classroom, possibly online, and that can come from their peers. Other sources then might be their professors or from administrators. From a professor's point of view, there's different reasons then you might think, well, why aren't other professors speaking up? Why are there only a few, even though they're tenured? So I think that there's various reasons then why professors would be afraid for speaking up, and it can be any combination of the list that I'll go through. So one is that you might have complaints from students who'd be upset that professors are expressing views or presenting facts that aren't politically correct. Second is that the professors then might be themselves ostracized in their workplace or online, let's say through social media. A third place is that they could be charged then with harassment or discrimination because the way the university policies are designed, they focus exclusively on outcomes, and intent is not even is considered a non-issue. Right? So in terms of that is that when professors then, under those kind of circumstances, can be disciplined, reprimanded, there's even the issue of possible dismissal. So you might wonder then if that's happening, why might they not speak out? So one possible reason for that is that when these cases happen, they eventually then go to arbitration. And the rules of arbitration are different from the regular court system. And so it can be a long, drawn-out process that can take years. And as well, it's quite expensive because it involves the union having to pay legal fees. And so what the union then oftentimes now tells the professors, the faculty members who are expressing their views, is actually not to post on social media, don't talk about this, keep this confidential. The reason is that if you do that, then that could work against you in the case of an arbitration. So that's the rationale that is provided then in terms of telling professors not to speak out. And so we might not know for years what's going to happen until you know the outcome of the arbitration hearing. And so I think one could argue that there's different ways that a union could advocate for their members, so that's one possible route. But another possible route could be maybe saying, okay, we'll have a media committee that'll get set up. If we see that the situation is really just preposterous or seems to be clearly frivolous, we can maybe make the case for you, make some bad publicity, and then hopefully that would get, let's say, the campus community to mobilize or the general public to mobilize, and that could be even maybe prevent a dismissal and save costs. But to my knowledge, that's not an approach that has been adopted. So I guess given that context, I think that would explain why professors and students might be afraid to speak. But despite all this, I think there is reason for hope and to be optimistic. So we are going to be having a federal election in 2019. And so I will put some ideas out here, just the general ideas that I'm hoping that people will discuss these ideas, the relative merits, and come to some kind of a census that we can have as a society. So the general approach that I'm thinking is that with the election coming around the corner, is that we do make this into an issue that is discussed at the election so that our actual university system becomes one that is one of intense public debate. So there are various solutions, and I don't want to be heavy-handed. So the ones that I've tried to come up with are ones that would give flexibility and wouldn't be the state imposing its will. But the general idea is that all forms of funding to our universities be temporarily withheld until the following two conditions are met. So one is that our universities make a firm commitment to free expression. And then the second is that our universities come up with both a short-term and a long-term plan to address the issue of viewpoint diversity. So the general idea is that they come up with ways so that universities go back to being places where any idea can be discussed and no idea can go unchallenged. Thank you.
We're fighting the good fight from within the university management establishment, right? You're part of all of that. Where are the boards of governors? Where are the politicians? There's a fair amount of reporting on all of this in the papers and the media, and yet there seems to be silence from the levels. I mean, the funders, the people who give money to these institutions. Where are they?
I have not heard a word from any of them. So the only comments I've heard is from one of the candidates for the Progressive Conservative Party, John Lohr. So he's the only one who said anything about this issue at all.
Mm-hmm. And are you, in your own work and in your own circle, attempting to mobilize other professors with more of your point of view?
I can't really say too much about my own situation at this talk.
Can you say why you can't say anything about your situation?
Well, I would not want to, I guess, say anything that could hurt myself at an arbitration case.
Does that mean there's one underway, or you're worried about one being precipitated?
Yeah, I guess at this stage it would be working against my interests if it were to happen.
Really? Okay, well, here's an example of someone hesitating in their free speech.
Yeah, the way I kind of approached it, though, too, is I could have used this as a platform to just talk about myself, but I thought I'd rather use this opportunity, though, to speak for those who have been silenced or are in the process, and rather be a voice for those who don't have one, rather than just being all about myself.
Sure, but is someone trying to silence you?
Well, I guess I can say I do have I have definitely made a lot of enemies on campus. But sometimes it is worth it if there are principles that are worth defending. I guess I'd probably end by, that quote by Bruce Cockburn saying, nothing worth having comes without some kind of a fight. Got to keep kicking at the darkness till it bleeds daylight. And so that's the inspiration I'm trying to use in this struggle.
All right. Well, good luck.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming out.
Yeah, thanks for having me.